Hey everybody. So I'm gonna start. I can never figure out how to wear this hat properly. Maybe it's the angle. I'm gonna be reading the second half of chapter 21. Is that correct? No, sorry, chapter 20, and then chapter 21, and that'll be it for today. And I will pick up with chapter 22 for tomorrow, and that will bring us to page 333. And from that point, it will be, let's see, final epilogue ends on page 458, so we're getting close. So we are still at the preparation for the actual battle at this point. Jovan rejoined Joseph at the barricade to see the Broken had shifted positions and were now slowly approaching their post. They were still almost a mile away, but already he could see the army splitting into attack groups, and could estimate the numbers being redirected to the flanking position along the west side of Delmore. The majority were coming at his barrier, almost 1,000 men to his 100. He could see a unit of gnolls not far behind the main group. Things were not looking good. Javaneleth eyed Joseph behind him and asked, "You're certain they can only come through the main gates? There's only a livestock fence surrounding the backs of the buildings." Joseph said reassuringly, "There are hardly any gaps between them, and such a maneuver would waste a lot of time, and besides," he grinned ruefully, "they know they have us outnumbered." Jovan found this information made him feel only more nervous about the coming battle. He adjusted his metal-studded armor and checked his bowstring yet again. It was still taut and dry, exactly as it should be. He took a deep breath and tried to calm his nerves. Joseph patted him gently on the shoulder. "We'll be all right, young man. Just stick with the plan." "Of course, we stick with the plan." The young ranger watched the column moving towards Logan's position speed up and past the others. There were about 500 men in that group. That left reserves within the opposing army of a size more than twice what was being hurled at them. Despite himself, Javaneleth was impressed with the careful and methodical maneuvering of the Broken. They were functioning much more like a trained army than a massive rabble, which was contrary to his own experience when he'd faced them in the past. In the end, though, it was their numbers that they would rely on, and yet this coordination would make them far more dangerous. Jovan's eyes continued to follow the flanking soldiers who moved in a straight line towards him, then suddenly banked a sharp turn to the west for the gate. It had been an attempt at a feint at his position to draw men away from the west entrance. Apparently the Broken didn't know the defenders had already split their forces, a rather small consolation. Jovan watched the larger section as it also increased its pace. He removed his bow from the watertight leather sheath holding it and selected an arrow. The men around him followed suit. Joseph began talking calmly about what they were to do. "They'll come at us within a mass, without order or plan. Aim for the center of the attackers. That way, if your shot is off, it may sail short or wide and still strike a target. Do not abandon the wall to reload. Duck down, string a new arrow, then stand and fire. They'll have their own archers, so be quick about it." The men slowly digested this information as Jovan stepped up onto the bench and gauged his position. His chest was revealed to the opposition, not a wise thing to do, but he had a much better line on the oncoming army. The others clambered onto the bench beside him, and Jovan spoke. "Wait until I fire. We want them close enough that we do not waste arrows." Again there was no response. Javaneleth watched the enemy coming toward him. They had increased their gait again and were now moving at a steady jog. Their faces were becoming less blurred now. They were about a quarter of a mile away. Jovan saw the lead man raise his sword and take a bestial cry of rage. The others around him followed suit, and now the entire column was charging at a breakneck pace, lungs bursting with a roar. Jovan raised his bow as they closed and drew back his shaft, noting the rest of the defenders mimicked him. He spoke loudly. "Hold! Wait for them to close." The men beside him were shaking slightly, their arrows clattering against the curved wood of the bows. Javaneleth glanced to either side and saw the fear, knew it was his own, and swallowed. He looked back at the attackers and saw they were about to be in range. He drew his bow back farther. "Now!" Jovan's shot flew straight and true, followed by 40 or so other shafts that were of varying accuracy. He watched them thud into the mass of incoming bodies and heard the cries of agony. Almost instinctively he yelled down, and the defenders atop the bench ducked to restring fresh arrows. One man was too slow, and an enemy shaft caught him in the throat, sending him gurgling to the others below. The barrier, who had no bows, were waiting with spears and other implements they could use as melee weapons. Jovan found himself transfixed by the dead man's body, where his eyes seemed to stare accusingly at the young man. Joseph's hand landed on his shoulder and heaved Javaneleth to his feet. His eyes alive with a fierce light, Joseph hissed, "Shoot, boy, now." Jovan snapped out of his trance and turned to loose another arrow, strike another foe, and then ducked down again. This time, none of the defenders was hit with an enemy shaft. Jovan looked at Joseph and nodded. The old man grinned madly and turned to fire again. Jovan rose quickly and did the same, noting that the enemy was now close to the mud pit. He heaved himself up again and fired blindly, but was rewarded with a cry from beyond the wall. The routine began to seep in, and Jovan found himself acting mechanically and thinking almost serenely about how Logan was faring. Logan had a slight advantage in facing a much smaller force, but he had noted that his opposition was behaving rather oddly. He He'd heard the battle cry of the men assaulting Joven and had assumed he would be dealing with the same bloodlust-filled charge, but instead, this column had slowed and spread out in a great line. Logan stood atop the bench with Grimtooth, eyeing the enemy and speculating at this new development. "I didn't like it, Logan." Grimtooth spat and fingered the edge of one of his throwing axes. "They'd be acting too strange for Broken." "I agree," said Logan, "but we have no choice to wait and see what they do." Grimtooth studied the group before them a moment longer, then reached down and grabbed his brother's gauntleted hand. "Logan, look to the north." Logan followed the orc's pointing arm and saw a massive ballista being towed swiftly by a troop of well-muscled gnolls. The machine was like a titanic crossbow on wheels of wood, rolling creepily but steadily into position. The string was thick and taut, looking more than capable of launching the heavy bolt that was thicker than 3 spears. It had a huge metal point fixed and ready, waiting to be hurled like some terrible steel comet at their meager barrier. Logan grunted and said matter-of-factly, "We have to put that thing out of commission before they can use it, or they're going to be through the barrier among us in short order." Grimtooth tucked away his smaller axe and leaped off the wall to grab his weighty battle axe from the house against which he had leaned it. Shouldering the huge weapon, he called to his blood brother, "Give me some cover on my way back." Logan waved his signal he'd heard, but he was already shouting to his men to move away from the wall in case the weapon was fired before Grimtooth could reach it. They seemed confused, watching the massive orc disappear down the street in the direction their families had gone. Logan struck a fearsome stance and cried, "Forget him. We've a battle to fight. Archers to the sides of the wall and out of sight. Wait for my signal. Everyone else, get under cover." At this command, the men quickly moved to obey. Logan took up a position kneeling on the wall to watch. He rubbed the pommel of his sword, anxiously waiting for the sign that Grimtooth had made contact with the enemy host, and trying not to betray his fear for his brother. Grimtooth trotted down the street to the stables, which had been conveniently located along the west side of town, therefore allowing him with a straight shot to the enemy. He strode in and let his gigantic warhorse thunder out of his pen, allowing the steed to nuzzle his huge shoulders a moment before saddling her quickly and steering the beast to the entrance of the stable and whispering, "Dinna move, ye great dunce. I'll nae have ye breaking out loose here. Stay right still now." Turning, he took his huge axe in both hands and gazed at the back of the wall of the stable, judging the location of it to the field that he faced away from. Settling on a location, he hefted the weapon, took a deep breath, and let out a roar. "Angledeus!" Grimtooth swung his axe and hurled his body forward behind it, exploding through the wooden wall of the stable and stumbling out into the open field around Delmore. He could see the enemy and the approaching ballista now almost in position some 100 feet or so behind a line of broken soldiers. Grimtooth made sure they'd not seen him, focused as they were on the assault, and then whistled sharply for his mount as his mount trotted to him obediently. He slung himself into Thunder's saddle, grabbing the reins in one hand and thrusting his axe into the leather strap across his back. He spurred the great horse onward, out and around the enemy force, using the rolling hills for cover. With his free hand, he selected an axe from the seemingly endless collection about his midsection and tested the weight. Smiling to himself, he urged his horse to greater speed, circling the broken contingent as swiftly as he could. Goranath had heard the main force let loose its battle cry and was unable to restrain a small smile from crossing his face. His foolish rivals would never see the force of gnolls, over 50 of them, until it was too late. True, perhaps killing several hundred of his own men was not a strategically sound move, but he could not allow them to live and grow in confidence to eventually challenge his own command. Hopefully his own soldiers who he had sent with the main force would remember to peel off from the attack so as to avoid the wrath of the gnolls coming in behind them. It would be a shame to lose more than the 300 men he wanted dead because their greed spurred them into the attacking line. For his own part, Goranath was ready to put an end to the battle swiftly by blasting a hole in the town with his favorite war machine, the ballista. It was a massive and murderous contraption. The ballista took all 6 gnolls, with Goranath directing them to drag it, its wheeled girth, leaving massive troughs of upturned dirt in its wake. The bolts it could hurl were 3 times as thick and powerful as a spear or javelin. The siege weapon was made to do only one thing: smash their opposition in any defenses they might employ. It had not failed Goranath yet. Coming behind the few defenders this town had been so foolish to leave was going to be great fun. Goranath always preferred to look on the faces of men caught with a knife in the back. It had irked him at first to see that the people of Delmore had split their forces to prevent his plan from being perfectly executed, but his good mood had returned when they abandoned the wall as his siege weapon appeared. Goranath stood at the center of his line of men, watching the ballista move into position with the effort of the 6 gnolls towing it. A bigger smile split his scarred face. This was going to be a bloody fun day. Suddenly a cry came from the right side of his line, and he turned to see a lone rider charging toward his cherished weapon. The mount and its occupant were massive, the rider certainly not human. Goranath was mesmerized, unsure precisely what this lunatic intended to do against 6 armed gnolls. He watched the figure raise one hand and then snap it forward in a blindingly rapid motion. To his horror, an axe hurtled into the lead gnoll, just turning to face this threat and split its skull into chunks. Goranath was stunned only for a moment, and then he was screaming to his men, "Stop him! Go! Kill the rider! Kill him now!" Grimtooth had already released his second missile and crushed the chest of another gnoll as the distance between them and his racing horse diminished swiftly. The others had grabbed maces and swords and were crouched, waiting for him. Grimtooth did not hesitate. He charged directly among them. Standing in his stirrups, he released the reins and pulled out his huge axe, holding it above his head. He clicked his tongue as they neared the first knoll, a black-skinned monster holding a titanic mace ready to swing. Thunder twisted to the left as he launched himself from the saddle and directly at the knoll. Gnolls are large creatures with long arms and a terrible reach that's beyond that of any human, but orcs are massively built and terribly fierce. Grimtooth swung sideways in a large arc, and the gnoll's snarling head went 10 feet to his right. Landing, he turned to face the next creature with its heavy broadsword closing the gap between them. Grimtooth waited and then swiftly sidestepped the beast as it lunged towards him. In an almost casual manner, he thrust his right hand up and grabbed the monster's throat in his powerful grip, crushing the windpipe. And in the same motion, he turned and hurled the body at the other two, who were charging at his exposed left side. The corpse took one creature full on, knocking it flat, but the other managed to stumble aside right into a vicious uppercut from Grimtooth's half-moon battle axe. In 2 strides, he was beside the final creature and delivering the killing blow with the butt end of his axe haft. Breathing heavily, the mighty warrior looked behind him to see that the broken force was coming back towards the war machine. Among them he saw a red-clad man laying about with his sword in a rage, trying to drive the raiders onward still faster. Turning his back and knowing he did not have much time, Grimtooth grasped the base of the ballista, dropping his axe to the ground. With a roar of exertion, he heaved upward, his muscles bulging, and tossed the ballista back over front, crashing it into the oncoming attackers. Gornath was quick enough to dodge the splintering wood of his prized ballista, but it buried a score of his men under its great girth. Drawing his cutlass, the broken leader, in a rage, hurled it toward the titan that had dared to insult him with his attack, determined to kill him himself. As he closed the distance, he realized it was an orc he was dealing with, and even Gornath was surprised to encounter such a fearsome enemy here. It was even more of a shock to find the creature was fighting for the defenders of Delmore. Almost within range, thinking he would have a chance to express his rage against his foe, Gornath instead found he had just enough time to throw himself aside as the orc's warhorse blew past him and his hated foe pulled himself into the saddle and began riding hard for the western gate. Gornath recovered swiftly, shouting, "Follow him! They'll have to open the gate so we can return." The broken fighters were in a state of shock, but it quickly turned to anger as they spun to pursue the demon that had shattered their assault. Grimtooth rode hard at the gate, knowing he could not hope to jump it on his mount, nor could he ride to the hole he had created and allow the broken to follow him. Unsure of what else to do, he simply spurred Thunder forward as though divine intervention would solve the problem for him. In a way, it did. Knowing as well as his rider that he could not clear the barrier, Thunder skidded sharply to a halt and sent Grimtooth flying over the wall directly into his waiting brother. Logan tried to avoid the living missile hurtling down upon him, but his blood brother was far too large to sidestep. The two crashed to the ground below the wall, Grimtooth atop his armored friend. The orc was breathless, but he managed to grin. "Well, Logan, how was that?" Heaving his blood brother off him, the knight grunted, "Top marks for the deed, but you and Thunder need to work on your escapes." Helping Grimtooth to his feet, Logan called to the archers, "Get on the wall, they won't be far off." In answer to his words, a hail of arrows came over the barrier, striking several defenders just mounting it. Logan felt 2 shafts clatter off his heavy mail, and Grimtooth grunted in pain as one found its way into his shoulder. Snapping the thin wood, he tossed it aside in annoyance. "You'd think they'd at least wait till I was settled in." The two rushed back to the wall, which Grimtooth's horse had abandoned for the comforts of his stable. Gornath was too enraged to watch the path of the animal back to the hole in the defenses, or he might have been in the town by then. Instead, he was standing behind his men, beating the stragglers onward and urging them to the barrier. They stepped into the massive pit of mud, sinking to their knees in the rain, and found themselves easy targets for the defenders. Gornath yelled to his own archers, "Keep those bastards' heads down. The rest of you use the others' bodies for purchase. Get over the damned wall." Grimtooth was standing in plain view, taking careful aim as he launched light throwing axes into the enemy ranks. Logan stood below him, calling up questions about the enemy as he fought. "How many?" "About 500, maybe." "Is the mud holding them?" "They be using the bodies to get onto the wall." Logan grimaced in frustration. He hadn't anticipated that. Looking into the street, he saw Neep and Diaga approaching the barrier. Neep stood near the young mage, who knelt by the wounded men and took their heads in his hands, whispering strange words. A pale glow enveloped their heads, and his hands and the wounds seemed to improve. Their heads and his hands and the wounds seemed to improve, the bleeding slowing and the pain subsiding. Diaga paused at every fallen man, even those clearly dead, to make sure there was nothing he could do to help. Logan called him over, and the rogue boy kept his head low to avoid errant arrows as he reached the wall. "Yes, Logan?" "I need you to go to Joven's position and see what you can do. I do not have anyone to spare as a messenger, so you'll have to play the part. He's likely got more wounded as well." He eyed the wizard up and down. "How are you holding up?" Diaga shrugged. "I've not exerted myself greatly yet, but the battle has just begun." "You told me earlier you might have a spell to help us in the actual fighting. Do you stand by that?" "Of course." "Then save your strength, mage. We're going to need it." He glanced up the wall as Grimtooth bent down, snapping a second arrow from his shoulder. "Hurry, Diaga." The young man turned and started running toward the north gate. From his position at the northern barrier, Javanaleth stood mesmerized by the scene before him. The majority of the attacking broken had split off to the sides, and a smaller contingent had rushed into the mud pit and was being systematically slaughtered by the defenders. There seemed to be no reason for this except some kind of personal grudge between the broken soldiers, as those who had not charged into the trap were jeering and mocking their wounded and dying allies. Joven and his men were still firing arrows at those trapped in the quagmire, but there was almost no point. The attackers trapped before the barrier were unable to reach the wall. Joseph ducked down beside him to take a breather, and the two discussed the situation. Odd, said Joseph. They seem intent on just letting us kill these men. It's as though they're being served up as free victims. Could they be out of favor with the commanders? Joven paused thoughtfully. I think I saw some clan armbands amid the men below. They usually denote a chieftain or a personal guard. A political execution, then. So it would seem. The two sat silently a moment longer as Javaneleth counted the arrows he had left. Suddenly a cry of horror came from both beyond and along the wall. Joven leaped to his feet and saw a mass of armored gnolls approaching the town of Delmore at breakneck speed. The men who had peeled off from the attack gave them a still wider path, and the monsters collided with the mass of wounded and immobilized Broken and began massacring the soldiers in the mud pit with incredible ferocity. Joven was stunned, and it took him a moment to realize that the next place these beasts would assail was his position. He yelled to the defenders, "Forget the Broken, shoot the gnolls, shoot the—" An arrow drove Joven off the wall and hurled him to the ground where he lay still. The defenders about him glanced his way, and his still form left them convinced he'd died. Before there was a chance to take this in, a huge gnoll wearing a hodgepodge of steel plate armor clambered onto the wall and swept 5 men from the bench with a single swinging blow of his long spear. Javaneleth blinked and shook his head to clear it. He looked up to see a concerned Diaga kneeling over him, and the gnoll overtaking his defensive barrier. Diaga placed a hand on Joven's chest where the arrow had buried almost a quarter of its length into his flesh. "Let me help you." But Joven was not listening. He shoved Diaga away and stood, grasping the arrow. With a howl of pain, he broke the shaft off at the point of entry. He was filled with blind rage, watching the gnoll take the wall, his wall. Javaneleth pulled his broadsword from his sheath and ran to the fence where the monster was now keening to the thundering sky. Reaching the bench, Joven jumped up on it and thrust his blade up under the worn chest plate of the beast, burying it beneath his ribs. The gnoll gurgled and looked at him in stunned silence, then toppled from the wall, dead. Joven stepped up in its place, then, ducking an arrow as it sailed over his head, he jumped into the mud and began laying about with his sword. The shock amid the gnolls was palpable. They were not used to a human, especially a fairly lithe one, attacking them with such visceral rage. Joven felled 3 more foes out of sheer force of blows, shattering rib cages and skulls with his heavy weapon. Joseph was above him, launching arrows into the other monsters, and shockingly, the two were driving back the gnolls with their assault. Others joined the old man on the wall. Some fell to the arrows, but most held their positions, and soon the now dark red mud was clear several feet from the defensive line, giving the people of Delmore a brief moment of respite. Diaga appeared above Javaneleth and extended a hand. "Come on, get out of there." Joven was in something of a trance and could not understand why Diaga wanted him to leave. He turned back to the enemy and now several feet away and saw a gnoll over 8 feet tall with deeply bronzed skin towering over his fearsome brethren. The creature snarled at him and began to move forward. Joven's good sense overtook his daring, and he scrambled up the wall with the help of Diaga and several others. Once on the bench behind the ramshackle defense, he ducked down with the mage and Joseph. Diaga reached for his wound again. "Let me see that, Joven." The young man pushed his hand away. "Later. I need you to warn Logan that we will have to start a retreat soon." "How long have the refugees been gone?" Diaga closed his eyes in thought and replied, "Perhaps an hour, maybe less." "That gnoll's going to break through this wall in minutes." Joven turned to Joseph. "Get the men without bows back. We have to keep the archers here as long as possible to slow them. Go, Diaga. Tell Logan to hold them as long as he can, and we'll manage here." The mage looked as though he was about to speak, and then he shook his head in frustration and turned away. Joven spun back to the wall and reached for his bow. Joseph handed it to him from the ground beneath the bench. Javaneleth started firing arrows back into the enemy forces, but it was a futile effort to hold them back. He spent more time ducked behind the wall to avoid the increasing number of broken arrows than he did shooting his own. Joven felt the barrier shudder and looked over it again to see the gnolls had reached the rickety wooden structure and were battering it with heavy weapons. The larger gnoll stayed back a few paces, then let out a guttural cry, and threw itself at the brittle defense. Joven tried to shove Joseph clear, and then he himself was sailing through the air, and landed in the slop of the street in a stunned heap. Dazed, Joven picked himself up and cast a look about to see where his bow had gone. Then he saw the wall, or what was left of it. There were 5 gnolls already in the town, and the archers who had not been blown entirely clear by the monsters were quickly falling victim to their vicious assault. Joven stumbled to his feet and found Joseph along with the reserve men, holding spears beside him. Pointing his sword at the enemy, Joven roared, "Charge!" The tiny detachment launched themselves to the gnolls and began flailing their weapons about in desperation. Javaneleth felled one creature and ducked as another nearly took his head from his shoulders with a hammer the size of his torso. Joseph stabbed into the monster's guard with the short sword, and the beast yelped in pain and retreated. The spears were thrust forward as the men of Delmore attempted to hold the gap a while longer. Joven stepped back a moment, trying to see through the debris where the enemy host was, and then suddenly 3 gnolls jumped from the top of the remains of the barrier and attacked the defenders' flanks. Joven spun on 2 of them, parrying a large worn axe and narrowly dodging a long spear that tore his leather armor. He kicked the weak legs of the first monster, causing it to stumble, and delivered a second kick to its wolf-like snout that knocked it over. The creature with the spear stabbed down, and its blade found Joven's thigh. Jovan screamed in pain and chopped downward, breaking the spear haft. Grabbing his leg in one hand, he tried to slow the bleeding, but he had no time to assess the extent of the wound. The beast he had kicked grabbed his uninjured leg and threw him onto his back. Javaneleth swung blindly downward, cutting the creature's arm from his body. Flailing, the monster collided with its companion, which had been about to finish Jovan off. Jovan took the opportunity to swing his blade with a backhand motion and slashed the creature's face, cutting out its right eye. The defenders came to his rescue then. Having killed the other beast by sheer weight of numbers, they managed to finish off the two Javaneleth had been sparring with. Joseph appeared at his side with someone else's bloody shirt, which he tore in half, and pressed forcefully down on Jovan's wound. Jovan gritted his teeth and gripped his sword handle fiercely as he sat in the bloody, rain-soaked earth. Joseph quickly tied the second half of the shirt around his thigh and pulled it tight. They exchanged only a look, knowing they had little time to rally what was left of their men before the gnolls would be among them again. Javaneleth heaved himself up and ignored the screaming pain in his thigh. The spearhead was still into him, which would slow the bleeding, but his entire leg was covered in blood. He looked at his remaining men and realized less than half still remained standing. They were hurriedly backing up as more gnolls came cautiously through the gap in the wall, measuring the tenacity of the remaining defense. Jovan cried out, "To me, men, to me! Retreat down the road. The gate is lost." The defenders of Delmore, what few of them were left, responded swiftly. Some had retrieved fallen bows and were firing missiles at the enemy as they backed away, hoping to keep the attackers at bay for even a moment. Jovan moved down the road as fast as his hobbling gait would allow, searching for a place to hunker down and try to make a stand. Joseph was beside him, watching lest he should fall in the slick mud. The others kept pace about them, and Jovan finally decided to make for an overturned wagon that had been crippled and abandoned during the first panic within the town. Turning, he could see the advancing Broken, led by almost a score of gnolls with the enormous bronze creature at their head. Ignoring the constant pain, he urged himself onward, striving to get to any place he might be able to defend for even a moment longer. Diaga had rushed back to Logan in anger. It was not anger born at Javaneleth for his stubbornness, or even Logan for allowing him to make such a suicidal stand. It was at himself that Diaga directed his frustration. He should have intervened and gotten Jovan away from the gate. Instead, he was playing messenger boy for real warriors. Diaga had managed to heal a few injured men at Jovan's position, but there were too many beyond his skill to aid. Caliandra had taken most of the severely wounded and been able to assist them, but even she would tire before long, and he was little help when it came to the most grievous wounds. For a brief moment, he regretted not having spent more of his time focusing on the regeneration school of the arcane, but he did not allow that to infest his mind with doubt. He must believe in his ability and keep his focus on the spells he had prepared for the battle, or he would be truly useless. He kept reminding himself that Logan had said it might be necessary to unleash his power in this fight. Neep jumped suddenly, a moment before Diaga heard the reddening crash from the northern barrier breaking. The two exchanged a glance, and Neep started back towards the gate, but Diaga restrained her. She looked at him, knowing he wanted to go back, but he shook his head. The two continued on to the western position to find the Algadea. Rounding the corner to the short length of street off the main road, they saw bodies strewn below the defensive wall. Diaga hurried forward, healing those he could while trying to assess the situation. Logan was atop the wall, struggling to fire a bow in a full suit of steel armor. He eventually gave up and grabbed a long spear and began stabbing over the wall at enemies that must have been just below him. Grimtooth was taking massive swings downward upon the head of the Broken. From the crimson staining, his axe looked as if it were connecting more often than not. Still, they'd lost many men, and the hail of enemy arrows had not ceased since Diaga left. Logan glanced back and saw the young mage. Urging his men onward, he jumped off the wall and rushed to his side. Diaga looked at the blood-stained face of the warrior questioningly. Logan paused to lean on his spear and said, "Could you destroy that wall with your magic?" Diaga paused to consider the inquiry. "I could, but why?" Logan wiped his forehead, saying, "I have a plan. How big would the explosion be? How big do you need it?" Logan looked at the youth to be sure he was serious. "It has to be big, but I want the remains to burn a while. Buy us some time." "That I can do. When?" "I'll signal you." Logan turned to go back to the wall. "Wait!" Diaga caught his arm. "Jovan's in a tight spot. The gnolls broke through the wall. I heard it just now. He said he'd retreat and try to hold as long as you could. But I think they are in grave danger." Logan considered this. "Then you better be ready soon. Wait for the signal." Logan hurried back to the wall and began calling out orders to his men. Diaga passed his staff without looking to Neep, who took the simple metal-bound shaft of soft pine gently from him. Neep carefully strapped it to her belt, sheathed her sword in her back sling, and stood waiting. Logan was ushering the men off the wall, surrendering it and ordering them back to hurry back to the position where the young mage stood. Grimtooth remained on the structure for one last swing, and then broken warriors began to appear at its top, and he abandoned his post to aid Logan. Most of their men had reached Diaga at this point, and the young mage needed no signal to understand it was time to act. Diaga rolled up his sleeves and pulled a thin new branch from out of the folds of his robes. Whispering softly to himself, he began to draw a circle in the mud before him, with expert flicks of his wrist. As he did, the mud began to steam and give off heat as though a fire burned beneath it. Diaga finished the finer points of detail within the circle, and he straightened, tossing the now burnt stick he had drawn with. He relaxed a moment and closed his eyes, lowering his hands, palms up above the circle. Diaga began a slow hum that seemed to further heat the muddy water. Sparks began to fly from it, and a small flame appeared. People around him were staring now in open awe. Some had been healed by him and respected his arcane ability, but their looks were changing into something closer to fear. Diago was not aware of anything about him. His eyes had rolled back into his skull as he focused on summoning the spell. Above him, a great black cloud was swirling in a funnel of darkness, lanced here and there with crackling shafts of narrow lightning. The people about him began to move away, some dropping their weapons and recoiling from the scene as they sought a safe place to hide. The streaks of lightning grew thicker, and a massive thunderclap exploded overhead. As Diago's humming grew louder, he snapped his hands palm downward and began chanting, Etater mer inferno, amatar inferno, conhimil inferno, la gratiaste inferno. At the last word, the increasingly large flame began to suck itself into Diago's hands and envelop them. The young man's eyes rolled back downward, and he watched the process with elation, pulling more and more of the magical fire from the earth to him, drawing on his inner strength into the depths of his attunement to the arcane. He determined at last he'd pulled enough, and the pool of fire suddenly went out, like a candle being snuffed. The flame still held firm in his hands, a raging inferno of heat and destruction. Diago's downcast eyes snapped up, seeing Logan standing before him, something like terror creeping onto his face. Diago spoke, and his voice seemed like that of a man much older. Move. Logan complied, and as soon as he was out of Diago's line of sight, the wizard could see the wall before him, teeming with jubilant broken men, their impending triumph raging through their bodies as they began to enter the town. Diago saw the leader, a man wearing an eye patch and carrying a scimitar and a long knife. He focused on his image and smiled. Goranath, from his position on the wall, sensed something amiss and looked upward. As soon as he saw Diago and his eyes burning into him, he turned, knowing what was coming, and started to launch himself off the barrier. Diago thrust his hands forward, and the hellish fire erupted before him, racing faster than the eye could follow towards the wall. As it did, the crackles of lightning began to snap downward and lash at the broken within the town, striking them with like fiery whips of vengeance. The fire exploded outward and smothered the people around it, who were entirely engulfed in flame 1 second, then simply obliterated the next. The fire raged and flicked about, lashing at scattered broken like a living thing as the lightning danced among their ranks alongside it. The screams were horrific. The ferocity of the fire seemed incalculable to Logan, who was now looking at Diago in stark shock. The young mage watched his work, then suddenly his eyes rolled back, and he sank down in a faint. Neep caught him expertly and carried him like a child away from the barrier. The men of Delmore gave the Firecat a wide berth and eyed her burden askance. Logan waved Grimtooth over, and they began to follow the mage and his guardian. The rest of the soldiers filed along behind them at some distance. They reached a small overhang that might have once been the entrance of a shop, where Neep rested Diago against the building and somewhat sheltered him from the rain. Logan set Grimtooth and the remaining defenders to check on the situation at the north end of town. The Anglo-Daik knelt beside Diago, glancing at Neep, who now removed a cloth and dampened it with some cleaner water from a pouch at her side. She gently dabbed it on Diago's forehead, and the young man seemed to stir at last. Glancing up, Diago first saw Neep and then Logan next to her. He smiled at Neep and at Logan, but the feeble joy died when he saw the look of the knight. He shifted slightly under his gaze and murmured, "So now you know." Logan said nothing, for he could not find words to express how he felt about this young man now. Before the demonstration of such forcefulness of will, he had considered him a nice youth with some affinity for magic. Now he was being made to assess him differently, as a mage, a truly gifted wizard. In Anglo-Deus, those who dabbled in the arcane were persecuted and exiled, or worse. Only the holy priests and paladins were allowed to study magic, and that came from their faith in Paladinus himself. Magic of a destructive nature, like that of wizards, was highly distrusted as a weapon of evil, but Logan had traveled with this boy for some time and even liked him. This new development left him confused, a bit frightened, but more than anything, sad. Diago had never struck him as a vessel for destructive forces, yet it was clear that his greatest power lay in causing immense harm to the world around him. To Logan it seemed a lonely, sad life. Diago processed the eyes of the Anglo-Daik in his mind and spoke softly. "It's always been this way for me, for mages everywhere. You want us there in the battle, but once you see what we can do, fear takes over. We're like a sword you can't control, a blade that thinks it is infinitely more destructive. But consider this, my dear Logan, I chose this life of revulsion. These people here, they'll never look at me the same way for what I've done today, and neither will you." Logan attempted to speak, but Diago cut him off. "Don't try to shield your conscience with an apology, Logan. I know how you feel about me, and I accept it. I was alone as an orphan, and I grew accustomed to it. You might say I have been training for this life from the day my parents were taken from me. My masters at Osmandius warned me this was my path, just as it had been theirs. I tried to run from it, with my parlor tricks and Neep's acrobatics, but this is who I am." Logan watched the young man before him as he shuddered from the cold and the rain soaking his worn robes. When he had lived in Alderlass, Logan had tried to make himself a man of common folk, to understand their struggles and dreams. Now as he made his journey through Tethanir, he was beginning to see what it really meant to be part of the wider world. Diago was parentless and without property or family. There was no home to return to. Logan could always go back to the house on Zenith Road and disappear into the luxuries of his esteemed name and lineage. Diago had nowhere to go. He was trapped by the ostracization of his life, and his only companion was a silent feline bodyguard. For the first time, Logan could picture the two of them traveling the roads from Nepal to Guayaquil alone, Diago carrying on a one-sided conversation with his only friend. A man more powerful than most mortals in the world, and because of his magic he was apart from them all. As the understanding came through more and more clearly, Logan felt his heart sink. He put his hand on Diaga's shoulder, and the mage, who had turned his head away, looked up at him. In that moment he saw Logan for who he was as well, saw the age lines in a man who could be no older than his late 20s, saw the graying hair and battle scars, and most importantly Diaga saw his calm brown eyes, the care that dwelt for him. Greater still, he saw it was genuine. Neither spoke a word. They merely studied one another for perhaps the first time. Then Diaga reached a hand out for Logan's shoulder, saying, "Help me up, knight. We have work to do yet." Logan lifted Diaga with some effort and leaped past the young man his metal-wrapped staff. Diaga leaned heavily on it as he tried to recover his strength and balance. He glanced up and caught sight of Grimtooth barreling towards them. Logan spun as well and saw the sadness in his friend's eyes. What? What is it?" Grimtooth halted, his chest heaving. "If be Javanaleth is men in him, they be surrounded." Logan pulled his sword free and started forward. "Then we must go to him." Diaga placed a restraining hand on his shoulder. "I think friend Grimtooth is saying more than he lets on." Logan looked at them both, and the orc sighed heavily. "He's trapped, Logan. The gnolls be keeping us out of the street. They want him dead before they go anywhere else." Diaga looked hard at Logan. "It'll buy us time to escape, his stand." Logan shook his head in fierce refusal. "I can't just leave him there. He's my responsibility. I have to go back for him. I'm not going to let him die alone." "He will not, Logan." The four turned in astonishment. Before them, sitting astride his gray horse in a mud-spattered cloak and chainmail armor, was Trem. His eyes were on the road in front of him. His sword was drawn, and the hand that held it was white-knuckled. Diaga gaped in surprise. Grimtooth shook his head as if staring at a ghost, and Neep eyed him distrustfully, and only Logan's reaction was to scratch his head. The half-elf finally glanced down at Grimtooth, and his eyes were burning hot. "Where?" Grimtooth pointed down the road, and Trem started forward. "There'll be too many of the bastards, Trem. We got to get clear here." Trem called over his shoulder. "Get the people out. I'll deal with the rabble." Grimtooth looked at the others in shock. "You can't mean to send him alone. We can't let him go." A thin, mirthless smile crept on Diaga's face. "We don't have a choice." Logan threw up his hands. "Enough. We have to save what can be saved. Get these people moving. Grimtooth, Diaga, you retrieve the horses. Quickly now." Logan watched them go and started down the road to Delmore. As he did, he paused and glanced back. "Good luck, half-elf," he whispered, and then he was trotting for the stables. Jovan had not anticipated that his enemy would be as clever as they were. His men had regrouped in the center of the road, about halfway from the intersection that led to the western barrier, a distance of about 200 feet from their original position. They pulled in any debris they could find to form as much of an obstacle around the wounded man from Bladeholm in the road's center. Javanaleth knew the road was too wide to be held by just over 30 men, so he decided to hunker down until enough time elapsed to make full retreat possible. He had not expected the gnolls and Broken to simply bypass them, cut off their escape from the small group by skirting the barrier, and surround them completely. They did not advance into town, but simply formed a line blocking the road south. Joseph wiped rain from his brow, only to have it replaced by the downpour above them. He grunted and nudged Jovan, saying, "Looks like we're not going anywhere today, lad." Jovan snorted. "Neither will they." Joseph smiled. "You're starting to sound like someone else I know." Jovan shot him a look of confusion, but Joseph was moving about the small circle of defenders, offering encouragement. The men needed little. They knew they weren't making it clear of the fight, but their deepest pride had been awoken. Javanaleth could only hope they would buy enough time for those riding south to escape. He intended to make this a glorious last stand. Placing his back against the wagon that was the centerpiece of his defense, he pulled out his bow and counted the remaining arrows. 12, a nice even dozen, and in his moment of desperation, Jovan found himself laughing. Horns sounded behind the waiting lines of gnolls and Broken. They had paused in entering the town, and they now stood about the small circle of Delmore's men in anticipation. Jovan waited, certain something was about to happen. From the ranks of enemy warriors, the massive bronze gnoll strode out. He was enormous, easily dwarfing his own kind and rippling with taut muscle and sinew. Jovan swallowed his fear as the monstrosity walked about before him, sneering at the tiny contingent of defenders. The beast had a huge battle-axe, one that dwarfed the weapon Grimtooth carried. The creature stopped its pacing and shot a glare at Jovan, then pointed the weapon at him. "You, boy, you are leader of these, yes?" Jovan replied, "I am." The gnoll leader smiled evilly. "Choice for you, then. Surrender, die quickly. Fight, die slowly. What you say." Jovan stared at the gnoll, and his mind reeled briefly. Could he allow the men to suffer if they were somehow captured alive? He looked about him at their faces, grim and blood-stained. They wanted to fight. A smile crept over his face, and Javanaleth whipped his bow upward, drew his hand to his shoulder, and loosed an arrow into the creature's chest. The monster stumbled backward and nearly fell, its face twisted in pain and shock. Looking down, Gren snarled at the shaft and roared in rage. Ripping the arrow from his chest, Gren left a gaping wound he seemed not to notice and cried, "Kill! Kill them all!" The Broken and gnolls rushed to the attack, but the men of Delmore were ready. Inspired by Jovan's defiance, they leapt to the defenses, shoving spears in the faces of the opposition. The attackers were repulsed and danced about a circle of biting spears, seeking a way in. Jovan and Joseph rained arrows on those outside, carefully selecting targets for their limited number of shafts. Joven was nearly to the bottom of his quiver when three gnolls hurled themselves onto the spears of the defenders, taking mortal wounds but laying about them so viciously they killed or drove back several men from Delmore and opened a huge gap in the defensive line. Dropping his bow, Joven hefted his sword in two hands and balanced on his good leg, waiting for the enemy to reach him. Joseph drew his own small sword and hefted a spear in the other hand. He put his back to Joven's and yelled, "I'll cover your rear, lad." Joven didn't have time to respond. Three Broken were closing on him, with weapons raised. Joven had learned a lot about fighting the Broken from his father. Lifting his blade high, he began to swing at their chests, but at the last second he cut hard and low, hewing the legs from underneath all three. The swing nearly toppled him, and his leg was shrieking in pain, but he gritted his teeth and ignored it, refusing to drop to the ground. The next to attack him was a gnoll with a rusty spear. Joven parried the blow, but the gnoll came in close, snapping at his throat. Enraged, Jovaneleth howled and drove the steel hilt of his sword into the thing's face, smashing its snout. The monster cried out and tried to back up, but Joven reached out and grabbed its shoulder, keeping it close. He bashed the hilt into the thing's face again and again until it was nothing more than a bloody mess. Joseph could not equal the young man's ferocity. He fought with tact and patience, measuring his opponents as they came to him. As efficiently as he could, he dispatched the attackers in its range with smooth and fluid motions, trying to keep the enemy clear of his younger ally. He disemboweled the first two Broken with his spear and stabbed his short sword into the chest before swinging his blade out and downward upon the man's head to finish him off. Noel seemed to ignore him, but the fight he and Joven put up was drawing the other defenders, and soon a small circle of 10 men or so had formed. They kept their weapons in constant motion, swinging them in spinning arcs to ward off the attackers. The man next to Joseph took a spear in the gut and collapsed, as good as dead before he reached the ground, but still swinging defiantly as he bled and writhed in pain. Two other defenders met with Noel halberds and went down. Joseph finally received a wound. A sword slash hit his spear arm, and in pain he dropped it, though the attacker lost his head to the old man's sword. Joseph slipped then, and went down among the feet of those still standing around him. The loss of 4 men left the circle too open, and Jovaneleth was soon battling enemies on 3 sides. He fought like a demon, killing anything that got too close. He impaled one gnoll, and in his fury swung his sword so hard and fast the beast was sent flying into a line of his allies. Then the massive gnoll Gren was before him, battle-axe hurtling about, killing his own men in his haste to reach Joven. The young ranger deflected the first blow and swung for the evil creature's legs, hoping to topple it, but the monster was too quick for him, and deflected the blow with ease. The two were locked in a bitter struggle, neither able to strike the other cleanly, but refusing to back down. Gren tried to punch the young man's face with its free hand, but the warrior ducked and delivered an uppercutting fist of his own that shook the gnoll to its core. Spitting out one of his fangs, Gren roared and redoubled his efforts with his large axe. The swings from the gnoll became increasingly powerful, and soon Joven was straining to hold his own against them, lurching out of the way or desperately throwing his blade up at the last moment to avoid a crippling blow. He futilely tried to counter, but his sword moved as though it was underwater. Finally, one of Gren's blows caused him to stumble, putting his weight on his injured leg, and he fell hard in the mud. Gren stood over him, howling triumphantly, and pulled a dagger from his belt to dispatch this annoying man like a pig for slaughter. As he brought his long dagger down to impale Joven, Joseph made one last desperate effort and dove in the way. Gren's blade bit into the old man's chest instead, and Joseph gasped in pain and shock. The gnoll grunted in frustration. Tossing the older man aside, he raised his axe this time, intent on finishing his work. A feathered shaft seemed to erupt from his shoulder. The force behind the arrow was so strong the point came through the back of Gren's muscled frame. He howled in rage and surprise and fell back a step, only to be struck again, this time in the gut, with another brutally powerful arrow. Blindly, Gren lashed out with his axe and caught something, an animal, he thought, and the beast whinnied and fell, its neck broken. Trem careened off his mount and delivered a 2-footed kick to the gnoll leader's chest, sending him sailing into his own army. The half-elf landed lightly and stood slowly, protectively, before Joseph and Joven's prone forms. The young man was weak now from his fall and loss of blood, but he saw the lengthy hair and its long matted curls above him. He noted the sword gleaming in the rain as it rested lightly at the figure's right side, etched with strange runes. Joven gaped and uttered in disbelief, "Trem?" The half-elf glanced back over his shoulder, and Joven read the sadness in his eyes, but there was no time for an apology. Gren was out of the fight, but his followers were about to renew their attack, and only one defender still stood before them, this strange newcomer. Trem swept his blade up and held it before his eyes, kissing the steel gently in a mocking salute. "Well," he asked quietly, "who would like to die first?" The unlucky victim was a broken soldier who lunged suddenly, hoping to catch Trem by surprise. In mid-swing, Trem whispered so softly Joven would not have recognized the words had they not been spoken before. "Eldath du Hakin." The sword in Trem's hands flared to life, and the red flame ripped through the man before him, leaving his body in 2 smoldering halves. The attackers paused a moment, then in a rush they hurled themselves at the solitary warrior. Trem began to dance, but that was the only way to describe it. He moved so fluidly from one attack to the next that Joven could not understand how he kept track of his own motions, and yet not a blade touched him, nor did a foe enter the small circle he held in front of Joven. The half-elf was wonderfully horrifying. He moved in such a hypnotizing way that Jovaneleth almost missed the incredible pain he was inflicting, severing limbs and heads with every flick of his wrist. Trem turned foes' weapons onto one another, driving broken blades into their allies' own bellies. His own weapon was just a part of his arsenal. He kicked and careened off his opponents like chain lightning, striking everything in his path. With a widening sweep of the blade, he spun, and in doing so, drove the circle of foes back even farther. He yelled to Jovanileth, "Hurry, Jovan, grab Joseph and get clear of here. I'll keep them distracted." Jovan heaved himself to his feet and lifted the groaning Joseph, calling to his rescuer, "I can't just leave you. You aren't. I left you. Go." Jovan looked at Trem, unable to move as the circle began to tighten around him. Trem's eyes found him outside the maelstrom, and he screamed, "Flee!" The Broken were no longer concerned with the young man or his wounded older companion. This new devil needed to die, and die quickly. Jovan forced his way out of the throng by laying about with his sword until he cleared a path. He stumbled out of a heap of bodies and bumped into something massive and armored. It snorted. Jovanileth looked up to see Ghost astride his titanic warhorse. The man was grim but looking determined. "Trem, is he in there?" Jovan could only nod. Ghost handed him the reins to another horse he'd brought with him. "You get going, young man. I can't leave him in there." Jovanileth was too confused to respond, and as soon as he had the reins in his hand, Ghost was careening into the battle, throwing the bodies of his foes about him like the wake of a ship. Jovan hoisted Joseph onto the horse first, then managed somehow to pull himself up as well. Leaning heavily on the horse's neck, he turned it slowly and began trotting out of Delmore. Joseph groaned behind him, and Jovan gritted his teeth against the jarring pain. "Hold on, friend, hold on." Trem was battling to extend his life by seconds at a time, and he knew it. He never intended to survive. From the moment he turned his horse around, he had known what he was riding to. Forsaking the words of Garrett Oakheart and embracing the realization he would die had been surprisingly comforting. All he wanted to do was hold their attention a while longer. If Jovan made it clear of Delmore, then Trem could consider his sacrifice worthy. A sword blade narrowly missed scalping him as he quickly dispatched the wielder, but too many slashes and cuts had reached him, and though he had avoided any serious injuries, he was bleeding from many small wounds. Trem fought on, waiting for the blow that would finally end the siege and his life. Suddenly there was a commotion behind him, and the attacker seemed to flee from his blade. Trem spun around to see what had caused the retreat, and to his astonishment there was Ghost upon his mighty warhorse, Karok, slashing and thrusting with his scimitar. The older man glared at him, saying, "Get on the horse, fool, I can't do this forever." Trem grabbed the saddle and wrenched himself upward onto the great horse. Ghost took a few last-second swings, then turned the animal and was off, riding hard for the south. They were soon clear of the army, and the Broken didn't seem eager to pursue them. The older man sheathed his sword, and Trem finally released his hold in the spell that kept his own blade burning, shoving it into the sheath at his side. As they passed the last house in the edge of town, Ghost slowed his pace, and Trem relaxed a bit. The two rode in silence for a moment. Then Trem asked tentatively, "Jovan." Ghost grunted. "I gave the young oaf the horse you were supposed to have. He had that damned old man with him, too, though he looked to be on his way out. They've probably met with the Angledaic and the mage by now." Trem sighed in relief, confident that Jovan was free of Delmore and danger, at least for the moment. He watched the graying length of Ghost's hair bob up and down in front of him, and then said softly, "You saved my life. All our lives." Ghost glared over his shoulder. "I do not want to hear any of it. I did not do it out of compassion. Do you understand? I need you, all of you. I can't reach Yulnar alone, and gods know what other trials may lie in South-Run. Besides, if you come along, maybe the rest will too, and the more weapons at my disposal, the better. None of this was about you. It's about me. My revenge, that's all that matters. I'll do anything to repay the debt I owe those in Nepal City." Trem sat in silence after this pronouncement and knew it to be true. What Ghost had done, he had done for himself, for he could not accomplish his goal of driving out or killing the invaders without help, and so far the only help he had was from those he met in Guy the Kill. As the rain continued to come down, Trem thought about the aftermath of the fighting in Delmore. It seemed that, against all odds, the others had survived. He doubted they would be happy to see him. Trem wondered what sort of reception they were riding towards. Ghost spoke once again, drawing his horse to a halt. "And look at all you've accomplished, half-breed. Look at your handiwork." The two gazed upon the fires of the now burning Delmore in silence. Ghost continued to talk somberly. All those lives lost back there, all the blood paid for the escape of a few people who will never be able to raise a sword against their punishers. Was it worth it, Trem? Was staying there and having so many die in vain worth the efforts of your friends? Think of the young man you were so desperate to save. Is he better off after seeing what he's seen and accomplishing nothing at the cost of his own innocence? Trem considered this. "I think that, of all of us, I understand you best. You want to fight on ground of your own choosing against foes deserving of your rage. Maybe the people of Delmore will never be able to avenge the crimes committed today, but they will live, and that matters. It would have been a waste to let Jovan and the others who made it out die back there." Ghost shrugged. "I suppose for once, half-elf, you might be right." The two turned back to the road, but Trem kept his eyes on the burning village. In his brief ride through the town, he had seen the vastness of the army waiting above Delmore and knew they had seen but an inkling of the power of the invaders today. The horrors that awaited them would be far worse than the glimpse given in the blood and muck of Delmore. Yet as he watched the flames burn under the driving rain, Trem had a calming thought. Eventually the fires would stop, the rain would wash away the dirt and grime of battle. Delmore would be empty, but some of her inhabitants were still alive and well. A new town might rise from the ashes of the old, stronger than the one before it. Perhaps some of those they had helped escape would one day return to bring about this new era. Trem had not lied to Ghost. He did understand him and his single-mindedness towards the world, and even agreed with it in many ways. In some lives, maybe revenge was all that could keep a person going, but for most it seemed that the hope of something better was all the motivation they needed. Trem still did not think lingering in Delmore had been the right choice. It had been an unnecessary risk that would not bring with its success new challenges. That would now bring with its success new challenges the weakly bound companions would have to overcome. But he understood why they had wanted to try. Faith sometimes overrides sensibility and logic. Guilt, a close cousin to Faith, had driven him back to Joven in the end. Now he would need to consider the outcome of his decision and the consequences that would come with it. That was chapter 21 and the second half of 20. I'll pick up on 22 tomorrow. You can send questions, thoughts, ideas to at Legacy Chronicle on Twitter. You can also find the videos under Vulture X21 on YouTube, and I'll take emails at trevorhpaul@gmail.com. Lastly, if you want to buy the book, you can find it on Amazon if you search T.H. Paul and the Legacy Chronicle. So we'll pick it up with chapter 22 tomorrow, and hope everybody enjoys the rest of the day.